191 children gone, starved to death. Not because of war, not because of a famine, but because a man convinced their own parents that dying of hunger would bring them closer to God. This is Paul Mackenzie, a former taxi driver who became a preacher. He led one of the deadliest cults in modern history. He promised salvation, but what he really delivered was horror. Families gave up everything. They left their homes and followed him into a remote forest. There, they were told to stop eating, stop taking medicine, and even let their children starve, all in the name of faith. How did this happen? How did no one stop it? And how does someone convince hundreds of people to give up their lives like this? Who is Paul Mackenzie? Paul Mackenzie wasn't always a preacher. In fact, he had an entirely different life before founding the cult that would become responsible for nearly 200 deaths. Before he was Pastor Mackenzie, he was a taxi driver, a completely ordinary man, working to make a living like millions of others. But something changed along the way. He left his job behind and decided to start a church, the Good News International Church. At first, it seemed like just another small religious group. Many churches in Kenya promise spiritual guidance, healing, and a path to a better life. But Mackenzie's teachings quickly became more extreme. He didn't just preach about faith, he preached about the end of the world. His sermons painted a terrifying picture. He told his followers that education was evil, medicine was the work of the devil, and that salvation could only be reached through total devotion. The most shocking part, he claimed that eating food was sinful. If his followers wanted to see heaven, they had to be willing to starve themselves to death. And people believed him. Mackenzie wasn't just persuasive, he was manipulative. He preyed on the poor, the desperate, and those searching for meaning. Many of his followers were already struggling in life, looking for hope in a difficult world. He gave them hope, but it came with a deadly cost. His church grew, and so did his influence. Soon, entire families were following him, listening to his every word, and giving up everything for the promise of eternal life. Then came the biggest shift. Mackenzie told his followers to leave behind their homes, their jobs, and society itself. He led them deep into the Shakahola Forest, where he would have total control over them. This was when the cult turned deadly. How the cult operated. Once Paul Mackenzie had his followers isolated in the Shakahola Forest, his control over them became absolute, cut off from the rest of the world. These families were now entirely at his mercy. There was no outside influence, no relatives to check in, no authorities to intervene, no one to question his increasingly dangerous teachings. Mackenzie had already convinced his followers that modern society was corrupt. Schools, tools of the devil. Hospitals, unholy places that went against God's will. Government authorities, agents of evil trying to lead people away from salvation. To his followers, he wasn't just a preacher, he was their only true guide to the afterlife. And his final command was the most devastating of all. He told them that the world was ending, and that they needed to prepare by fasting to death. The only way to reach heaven, he claimed, was to stop eating and allow themselves and their children to die. At first, the starvation was voluntary, but soon things took a darker turn. Survivors later reported that those who tried to leave or secretly eat food were punished. Some were beaten, others were forced to continue starving, and the ones who resisted, they simply disappeared. The children suffered the most. Many were too young to understand what was happening, but their parents, completely brainwashed, refused to feed them. Some children tried to find food in the forest, but they were stopped. Witnesses described heartbreaking scenes. Young kids crying from hunger, while their parents, convinced they were doing the right thing, refused to help. It was a slow, agonizing death for hundreds of people. And no one knew it was happening, until bodies started to pile up. The horrific discovery. For months, Mackenzie's followers starved in the forest, unnoticed by the outside world. Then, in April 2023, a tip led authorities to Shakahola Forest. Someone had escaped and reported that people were dying. What police found when they arrived was worse than anyone could have imagined. Shallow graves. Dozens of them. At first, they thought it was a small cult tragedy, something horrific but limited in scale. But as they dug deeper, they kept finding more bodies. Dozens became hundreds. The majority were children. Even hardened investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. Entire families had wasted away in the name of salvation. Skeletal remains told the story of months of suffering, of starvation taken to the absolute extreme. Some of the survivors were so weak they couldn't stand. Many were barely clinging to life. One police officer later described the scene as hell on earth. It was now clear, this wasn't just a cult. This was a mass murder, and Paul Mackenzie had orchestrated it all. How he was caught, and the aftermath. When the authorities realized the scale of the tragedy, they moved quickly. Paul Mackenzie was arrested in April 2023, along with several of his top followers. But even in custody, Mackenzie showed no remorse. He denied responsibility, claiming that he never forced anyone to starve, that people were simply following their faith. He painted himself as a misunderstood preacher, not a murderer. But the evidence was undeniable. Survivors told investigators about the punishments, the forced starvation, and the way Mackenzie manipulated them into giving up everything, even their children's lives. The mass graves spoke for themselves. As the investigation continued, the Kenyan government cracked down on cults and unregulated religious groups. Many called for stricter laws to prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future. But for the families of the victims, no amount of justice could bring back their loved ones. Many were left asking, how did this happen? And how was a man like Mackenzie allowed to operate for so long without being stopped? The answer lies in the bigger picture, the conditions that allowed him to rise to power in the first place. Why people followed him. It's easy to wonder how anyone could believe something so extreme. How could parents let their own children starve? How could hundreds of people willingly walk into death? But cults don't work on logic. They work on fear, desperation, and manipulation. Most of Mackenzie's followers were already struggling. Many were poor, uneducated, or facing personal hardships. They were looking for answers, for hope, for something to believe in. And Mackenzie gave them that, wrapped in the language of religion. He preached about a world full of evil and corruption. He told them that modern society was designed to pull them away from God. He used their struggles as proof. If they were suffering, it wasn't because of poverty or bad luck. It was because the world was wicked, and only true believers would be saved. Over time, his followers became isolated. They cut ties with family and friends who didn't share their beliefs. They stopped questioning him. They gave up everything. Money, possessions, even their own free will. By the time he told them to starve themselves, they weren't just followers. They were trapped. Many survivors later admitted that they had doubts, but were too afraid to speak up. Some feared punishment, while others truly believed that leaving the cult meant losing their chance at salvation. It's a terrifying example of how one person, given the right conditions, can gain absolute control over others. The role of the authorities. Could this have been prevented? One of the biggest questions surrounding the Shakahola massacre is simple. How did no one stop it sooner? Paul Mackenzie had been on the authorities' radar before. His church had been investigated multiple times for promoting extremist views. In fact, he had even been arrested twice before for encouraging children to drop out of school and rejecting modern medicine. But each time, he was released. Why? Because in Kenya, as in many other countries, religious freedom is protected by law. Unless there was a clear evidence of crimes being committed, authorities couldn't just shut down his church. And so, Mackenzie continued preaching. Some former members had already spoken out, warning about the dangers of his teachings, but their voices weren't enough. The government didn't step in until it was too late, until hundreds were already dead. This tragedy exposed a bigger issue: the lack of regulation over religious organizations. Kenya has thousands of small churches, many run by self-proclaimed pastors with little oversight. Most are harmless, but some, like Mackenzie's, become dangerous. In the wake of the massacre, the Kenyan government faced intense pressure to act. Leaders called for stricter laws to monitor religious groups and prevent cults from gaining power. But the damage had already been done. The people who trusted Mackenzie, who gave up their lives for him, could not be saved. Survivors' stories. The ones who escaped. Not everyone who joined Mackenzie's cult died. A handful of people managed to escape, and their stories are chilling. One woman, weak from hunger, crawled through the forest for hours before finally reaching safety. She told authorities how she had watched her own children die, one by one, unable to disobey the cult's rules. Another survivor explained how she had secretly eaten small amounts of food to stay alive, pretending to follow the fasting orders while waiting for an opportunity to run. One of the most heartbreaking accounts came from a man who lost his entire family. He had joined Mackenzie's church, believing it would bring them closer to God. But as things became more extreme, he realized something was wrong. He tried to convince his wife to leave, but she refused, too brainwashed to see the danger. When he finally escaped, he left behind his children, hoping to return with help. By the time authorities arrived, it was too late. These stories paint a horrifying picture of what life was like inside the cult. Constant hunger, fear, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. For the survivors, escaping was just the beginning. Many now struggle with guilt, grief, and trauma. Some have nothing left. Their families are gone, their homes abandoned, their lives completely shattered. The question now is, what happens next? The bigger picture: why cults still exist. Paul Mackenzie's cult wasn't the first of its kind, and unfortunately, it won't be the last. Throughout history, cults have formed in different parts of the world, always following the same pattern. A charismatic leader appears, offering people a sense of purpose, belonging, and answers to life's biggest questions. At first, their teachings seem harmless, even inspiring, but as their influence grows, the message turns darker. Fear replaces faith. Control replaces choice. And before anyone realizes what's happening, the followers are trapped. The Shakahola massacre is one of the worst cult-related tragedies in modern history. But it's not an isolated event. From the Jonestown massacre in Guyana, where over 900 people died after drinking poison, to the Heaven's Gate cult in the US, where followers willingly took their own lives believing they'd reach a spaceship, history keeps repeating itself. So, why does this still happen? It comes down to vulnerability. People join cults not because they're foolish, but because they're searching for something. Hope, security, a sense of meaning. Cult leaders prey on these emotions, using manipulation, fear, and isolation to gain control. And as long as there are people in pain, there will always be those willing to exploit them. The tragedy in Kenya is just a harsh reminder that cults aren't just a thing of the past. They still exist today, in different forms, some religious, some political, some disguised as self-help movements. And if we don't learn from history, more lives will be lost. Justice for the victims. Will Mackenzie pay for his crimes? As of now, Paul Mackenzie remains in custody, facing multiple charges, including murder, radicalization, and child abuse. The Kenyan government has vowed to hold him accountable, and investigations are still ongoing. But even if he spends the rest of his life in prison, is that really justice for the victims? For the families who lost their loved ones? No punishment can undo what happened. The children who died will never grow up. The parents who were manipulated into killing their own families will never get a second chance. The real justice lies in making sure something like this never happens again. And that means stricter laws, better education about cult tactics, and more awareness about the dangers of blind faith. Because Paul Mackenzie is just one man, If we don't address the bigger issue, another cult leader will rise, another group of people will fall under their spell, and another tragedy will unfold. Nearly 200 innocent people, many of them children, lost their lives because they believed in a man who promised them salvation. But this story isn't just about one cult. It's about the dangers of unchecked power, the vulnerability of desperate people, and the terrifying ease with which faith can be twisted into something deadly. So, what can we do? First, we need to talk about it. Cults thrive in secrecy, and the more people understand how they work, the harder it becomes for leaders like Mackenzie to succeed. Second, we need better protections, stronger laws to prevent dangerous religious groups from gaining influence, and faster intervention when warning signs appear. And finally, we need to remind ourselves that questioning is not a sin. Faith should never come at the cost of life, because no belief, no leader, no promise of heaven should ever justify the suffering of innocent people. Thank you for watching.